so it's okay.
So this is getting the most out of your physical security assessment, a client's guide.
So who are we? I'm Brent White and
I'm
Tim Roberts. So we have a personal blog too, and you can see from our shirts, We Hack People. This is where we talk about our physical intrusion, social engineering, tactics and techniques and experiences that we have. Also things like hotel hacking, things like that. So
also, if you ever want to see the slide deck, this is where we post it and some of our other talks.
So the whole point of this talk is we do a lot of physical intrusion assessments, physical security assessments, and we've seen common problems with different clients with a misunderstanding of what they need, what they think they might need, what they don't realize that they need. And so we're just going to quickly go over our three main types of physical assessments that we do. And that looks kind of small. Can anybody not read that at the bottom? No, it's kind of small.
Cool. All right, so one of the first ones that we do is a covert assessment. This is what we primarily do and what methodology that we're in charge of for our security team. This is an emphasis on real-world attack vectors. This includes social engineering. Oftentimes when you're doing a physical security assessment, you're talking with the client is not aware that social engineering is a part of that assessment. This is primarily for the covert stuff. We also do some overt physical security assessments. This is where we go with the client as we walk. Yes, I appreciate the GIF here for a moment. But we will walk with the client side by side, a lot of Q&A, asking about incident response, asking about how their cameras are hooked up, who's monitoring, things like that, the kind of devices and access controls that they have installed.
And so to kind of add on to that with these physical site assessments, as we're going through, we can really kind of dig deep into things like alarm sensor placements. How easy is it to bypass these? We can look at things like door configurations, window configurations, even start to look into documentation on how do you handle employees that have lost their badges, how do you handle guests, and so on. So this picture is actually, I took this on a physical assessment that I've done recently, and yeah, to the client's defense, it was decommissioned. Also, before it was decommissioned, it was a working camera that someone thought it was good to actually install it this way. Yeah, so how do you...
The slack on that cable is what gets me, is because I can reach it up there, Brent can reach it. So.
Yeah, so anyway.
So part of this too, when we do these kinds of assessments, the covert, oftentimes we focus on getting from A to B, a specific area, either the data center or an executive suite, an office, but this is something the client provides. So there's two big differences between the covert and overt, is that the overt is focused on things like that. So if you see something like that, then you're able to say, hey, look at that, or hey, look at this. Have you considered this, or what are you doing? Why is that up there? Is it even functional? These kinds of questions are great for those overt types of assessments, but the covert is more of, again, a criminal mindset, getting from A to B and how we can get there as quickly as possible, either tailgating or cloning a badge or something.
Yep. So red teaming, again, red teaming is where you take all these different types of attacks. You take the covert part of the assessment. You also include things like phishing, vishing, external penetration assessments, all these different things where depending on the client, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but depending on the client, your industry, your location, what things make sense to include in a red team, or does it make more sense to focus on different things during a covert assessment? And so that's mostly what we're sort of getting at here.
And we've mentioned this in some of our other talks too, that red team is subjective oftentimes in this industry. Purple team, all that stuff is kind of dependent on whoever's performing the assessment and that understanding. Yes?
Boil down to the scope then.
What's that?
Does it boil down to the scope then?
Absolutely. It does boil down to the scope. And even when you're doing like pre-sales and you're talking with your client or whatever, developing that statement of work, getting a clear understanding of what a red team is. Because sometimes we'll have a client come in and be like, hey, we want a red team assessment. Okay, cool. And then we talk with them and all they want is a wireless security assessment and
or a web app.
Or a web app assessment. And it's like, this is more of a the whole thing, right? The whole gambit or different attack vectors that are combined, and it's usually a longer engagement type. It's not just 1 week or 2 weeks or something.
Yep. Who in here does pen testing? Okay, so I'm sure you all have probably ran into scenarios where people are like, hey, I heard this really cool buzzword at RSA called Red Team. I want that. They're like, okay, well, here's all this stuff. Here's the budget for it. And like, oh no, we just, we have 2 web apps, and then we want you to look at, our Amazon instance or something. So
But
anyway.
for our red teaming too, how this kind of ties into what we were talking about with physical security, that's one of the attack vectors. So we'll attempt to do, things from external perspective, gathering OSINTs, doing all that recon and such before doing it on site, because we'll exhaust all those efforts, see if we can get access that way, and if not, then we'll try to send somebody in to drop a Dropbox or connect an access point to a remote in, or even do it wirelessly from the parking lot.
Yep. We could probably go on about red teaming all day.
Yes.
So. Oh, and something else here, probably should have mentioned this 7 minutes ago. If anybody has questions or anything, please ask us as we're going. Also, if you feel like heckling us too, that's cool. So, yeah, question.
Heckle.
Sorry, I was going to hold this again.
No, it's fine.
So you talked about physical assessments. How do you see, or how hard is it to sell a physical assessment versus covert? Because I get a lot of customers that they say they want a physical pen test, it's covert, whatever. That's not really what they want. They want a physical assessment.
So the question, how hard is it to sell a covert assessment as opposed to just a physical site assessment with the walkthrough, correct? And that's kind of what we're going to dig into that a little bit. Hopefully not as in depth as we want because of the time restraint, but there are different questions that you can pose to them.
And a quick response to that too is like doing hybrid type of security assessments where you go in covertly at first, and then once you're done, whether or not they catch you or whether you've obtained access, then do a walk through that half. So your level of effort may increase a little bit, but it's still they're kind of getting the best of both worlds with that approach.
Yeah.
Have you run into challenges with authorization or reception to your results as regards to having different departments in charge of physical security versus cyber?
Yeah, so have we ran into issues with results from physical versus other parts of the company like cyber and so on? Oh yeah, and that's one of the things where through these assessments we say, this is why it's important. Yeah, you might have these things locked down, but if anyone can walk in off the street and pull your server rack out and go out the front door with it, that's a breach, that's a problem. So
then also, and I say this, I think in every talk, if you look at any of our talks, but security awareness training too, doesn't boil down to just that kind of annual thing that you do or quarterly training that you take online or whatever. It has to be that culture too. And so one of the things that we'd like to test primarily with our physical security assessments is that security awareness training, covertly assessments, is that security awareness training, whether or not they are escalating properly. And we'll get into this a little bit in our next slides. So yeah, problems that we notice. I don't know what I want. Clients often aren't aware of options that they need. So again, some of those options, and just like he was saying, sometimes a client just has one idea of what a physical security assessment is. They're like, oh, okay, well, you're going to walk through and tell us where camera placement is, or what kind of badge access we have, or the incident response systems that we have utilized. And it can be more than that. And I think it's very important as we go into this next slide to assess these risks.
So for your question earlier, kind of to dig into that, when you're talking to a client about a physical assessment, what are their risks? Like, I guess the way that we like to ask it is, what keeps you up at night? And so by asking that question, you can start to get some legitimate answers from them about what they really worry about. So depending on the industry, are insider threats? You're looking at intellectual property that you're protecting, or outsider, or terroristic, and so on. So it depends on what your main risks are.
Yeah, and with that, that'll also shape your guys. So as a pen tester, if you're offering these kinds of service offerings, whether they're on-site social engineering or physical security assessments, is understanding what kind of guys is more appropriate, and understanding the industry, and testing that. Because if I'm wanting to get an idea of what an employee has access to or whatever, then if I'm going to pretend to be an employee rather than trying to be the cleaning crew or some contractor there to fix the printer or whatever.
And so something that Tim was talking about earlier before we came in here is that For example, with retail, they have a higher risk of insider threats with employees stealing property, things like that. So it just, again, it depends on your industry.
Yeah, and so as a client, how many people in here are clients that hire pen testers? There's like 3.
That's good.
No, so as a client, I think even understanding that too before you go in, be prepared to have those conversations with the pen tester to adequately request the services that you are looking for. Have an understanding, even like researching when you're doing a request for bid or whatever, if you have multiple security companies that you're kind of looking at, see what service offerings they have. Ask to see their methodology. Hey, can you guys send me a methodology overview so I can kind of see what your approach is for these types of assessments so we can kind of look at what exactly we were looking for.
Yeah, so if you're a federal facility, to add on to that, and let's say maybe you're a nuclear facility with high security, you're going to want to look at a pen test company that in their methodology they include things like surveillance, and they're not just going to show up for half a day and see if they can just walk in the front door. You want a company that has that maturity and the experience where they can assess and properly look at things for facilities like a nuclear facility and so on.
A key area of concerns as well, we've had some financial institutes that we do assessments for, and they'll be in really high crime rate areas. So keeping in mind that too, where are your facilities located? Are they downtown somewhere where there's a lot of crime, a lot of break-ins, a lot of car theft even? I think we did an assessment for a client a couple years ago where they had a few car theft incidents. So they just didn't even have camera coverage in their parking garage, and the arm was broken, so it was up all the time. So
Yep.
there's reasons for this, but I think it's good to have these kind of, especially the covert stuff, to say, hey, look, we just pretended to be criminals. Criminals could have done this, and we just saved you a potential compromise.
Yeah, and that was also the one, there was an ATM vestibule right across the street, and there had been a shooting there like a month before we had shown up. So if you are doing pen tests, like physical pen tests, and you go to certain areas, you also want to know what's the crime rate in that area, so you're not, walking around by yourself at midnight and go down the wrong alley or something.
Something else, just because the slide mentions it, oftentimes the power, the generators on the outside, they are not protected. They're just kind of sitting there. These are things to consider too, especially, if your risk is some kind of terroristic threat or, say you're a credit card debt collecting company or whatever, if you're just leaving the generators there and that's powering your data center and you don't have some kind of backup generator, or those are your backup generators, then it could be bad news.
Yep. And you had a question earlier, right? Nope, I thought you raised your hand. Never. Oh, okay, sorry. If it were an auction, you would have bought it, so. Okay. Yeah, you have a question?
Do you buy into the crime prevention through environmental design as a framework to explain to your customers why surveillance and territoriality and making through as a question of ownership are?
Absolutely. Actually, we talked to a guy, I think it might have been at DEF CON. This guy does a lot of drone hacking. And so one of the things is the design of the building and the metal plates on the ceiling, having, tinted windows and stuff from the outside, things like that. Because, those are real threats, especially with the size of drones now. Mavic has tons of tiny little drones that record like in very high definition and night vision and all that stuff. So these are actual things that, I think a lot of people don't consider. And it's kind of fairly new. It's not too new, but it's still new enough that clients oftentimes don't even consider that kind of thing.
Yeah, and again, if it's a bank or somewhere that needs to be more secure, you also want to make sure that you have the proper physical barriers in front to prevent a car from driving through the front door or trying to rip out an ATM. Also with cameras, you want to make sure they're proper placement, high enough resolution so that it can actually be used as evidence if needed.
Your incident response too, like your intrusion detection, like what do you have in place for that? A lot of times we'll do like brute forcing on badge readers, and most of the time too, I'll go up and I'll steal a badge or clone a badge, get close enough, and then Brent will clone that badge off of my clone, off of my Proxmark, and then we're using the same badge to get into multiple facilities, or you're using the same badge one right after the other to get access to a building because we've cloned a badge or duplicated a badge. Sometimes security and the clients aren't monitoring that, so they're not seeing, hey man, this same dude, John Doe, is badged in here, and he also badged into the data facility across town or another state.
30 seconds ago.
Yeah, so those kinds of things, I think tweaking it, a lot of those monitoring systems have those kinds of options.
Yeah, and so with the security guards, for more info on that, we have a talk called Security Guards LOL, where, I know it sounds immature, we probably should have rethought the title of that, but basically it's where we point out the issues of large corporations. Their physical security relies largely on one or two security guards. So there have been times where, we talk about, we clone a badge and then we share the cloned badge, and our badge cloners are hidden in like a coffee cup or a muffin bag or something, and we don't take it out, we just hold the cup or the bag up to the badge reader, and it's like, oh, Bob Smith just badged in 3 times. And the security guard through the window right next to us doesn't even notice because he's like watching basketball or something on his phone.
Yeah, oftentimes security guards are very distracted, especially because nothing happens, or that's the mentality that they get into. So they're sitting there on these things, watching Netflix or distracted or whatever. And then also the opposite can happen too. So that's something that we want to always prevent.
Yep.
But we made these shirts as a joke because oftentimes we'll be there and we'll get to from point A to B, or we'll get to our destination or get access to an area. And then after that, we're like, well, what else do we do? Well, let's put these shirts on and walk around and see if anybody says anything. So, I'm not supposed to be here. And that's why we had these shirts made.
Yeah.
So.
People don't pay attention. People laugh, or most of the time they just don't pay attention.
We had somebody actually recognize us one time too, and we won't deviate too much because we only got a few more minutes, but we were doing an assessment. He's like, hey, I saw your all's talk on breaking into a building, a hacker's guide to unauthorized access. Wait a minute, are you guys here doing a physical security assessment?
Like, you guys, and this was after we had just tailgated him into the data center area. But it was this guy, because there was a retina scanner, and Tim was right behind the guy, and so he put this badge up that was blank, and it beeped anyway because it does whether it's
I went
correct
through
or
the
not.
motions and stuff.
And he put his eye down to the retina scanner, and the guy was like, oh, you don't have to do that, it's not plugged up.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay. And then he was like, wait a minute. And we're like, no, we're not.
But it was funny because the entire time we were in there too, because he was like, oh, are you guys doing an assessment? We're like, actually, yeah, we're here meeting with the CSO. He's supposed to be over here. We just had lunch with him. He's going to meet us over here. Is there a place we can wait? And he's like, I'm going to be watching you guys. And he, the whole time, he just walks away, and we're just sitting there. We plug into the conference room.
He took us into the conference room.
DHCP's enabled. We get an IP address, and we start some scans just to grab some proof of concept because it was just a physical thing. And then we left.
Yeah, he's like, the whole time he was like, I'm watching you. He's like, yeah, we see you there. So, and going on with what should I have tested. So, understanding what you need and not being too scared of what a pen tester might find. If you really pigeonhole and lock it down, you're only setting yourself back. So the point of this is to see what vulnerabilities are there. What ways could a malicious actor really leverage these vulnerabilities and make you have a really bad day? So yeah.
After hours testing, is that something you want to look at? This is something to consider. Even as pen testers, this is something really to consider. As we kind of go to this next one here, I'll shoot you. There are some security guards out there that have an itchy trigger finger,
Ready to go.
Especially if you're doing after hours assessments. So we, no joke, had a client once. He was signing our letter of authorization, or AKA get out of jail free card. He was signing it, and he said, "Don't get shot." We're like, what? Wait a minute, what?
Yeah. Wait, let me call my wife real quick.
And he didn't tell us that they had armed security guards too, so that changed a lot. We were like, we're not doing this after hours, especially with a disclaimer, don't get shot. Okay. This should never be a concern as a pen tester. Yes?
What is on your list of, if a client says this, I'm not going to do this?
That's one of them.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's seriously one. So after an assessment, it was an evening assessment, and we were doing the report readout, and the statement was made by a security guard, if I had seen you, I would have fired at you. And this was like, it wasn't saying I would have challenged you, seen what you were doing. If I would have seen you, I would have fired at you. And at that point, it's like, no after-hours assessments with armed guards. I think that's probably safe, but yeah,
So we got
YOLO.
5 more minutes, so we'll hold off on questions till the end as we kind of rush through these last remaining slides.
So a lot of times clients will ask us, okay, as you gain access or as you're interacting with employees, we know you have like the cameras and your ink pens and all that stuff. Can you use that and show us later? And that's a really cool idea and it can be useful, but you really, really have to check with your local laws. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't think Tim's a lawyer, so we can't tell you yes or no. But
Not today.
yeah, not today. But ask a lawyer to make sure that you're not breaking any state or federal laws with these surveillance things like this. So.
And as a client too, make sure you're not just doing this just for the checkbox. These kinds of assessments, any pen test should not be checkbox compliant driven. I mean, yeah, that may be a requirement. That shouldn't be your driving factor.
But just a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, things to consider. What's your biggest concern? What's your biggest fear? What keeps you up at night? So depending on your industry, again, these are things that you should consider more. And unfortunately, I wish that we had more time to go more in depth on that. But
Yeah, this is also why we, go to the wehackpeople.com and you can check out some of our other talks where we get a little bit more verbose
Yep.
and a little more in depth. This is very high level. If you guys have any questions, I think we have like 2 more minutes. So I think Jim, you had a question back there.
Yeah, so what do you do if you encounter animals, guard animals?
if we encounter guard animals,
I've never had.
well, if you do surveillance and you do see that, haven't had the issue come up with that yet, but there are tactics around that where you can distract those depending on their training or the area. But at all costs, I would advise not having to interact.
Yeah, again, it's kind of one of those unpredictable deterrents, right? That especially like guard dogs. So I wouldn't risk any of my team to go and do that just because it's too great a risk. So
Yeah.
even as a client, you're looking at your risk, right? But you, as a pen tester, look at your risk as well.
Yeah, and somebody might say, well, throw the dog a steak, but if there's some sort of dietary restriction or something where that could harm the animal, now you've got a lawsuit, just stay away.
Spike only
Yeah.
eat shrimp. Yes.
What about when a client doesn't own the whole property they're in? They're on a floor of a building.
Yeah, the property management. So that's something that we actually run into, especially with the red teaming and wireless stuff. That's where partial disclosure kind of comes in. So when you're talking with a client, letting them, as a client, letting the pen tester know, hey, these are our rooms, these are our suites, here's a list of our access points. That way you're.
Them often getting permission from the property manager?
What's that?
You find them often getting permission from the property?
Yes.
Yeah, they have to.
Yeah, and sometimes too, we'll even use a property manager as a guise. One of the times I was pretending to be a property manager. I had a letter that I'd written out. We gave it to one of our team members. He pretended to be there to replace the sprinkler heads on the property. And he
Carrying a ladder
carrying a ladder around. Got in there, installed a wireless access point in the conference room, and we were able to connect from the outside. But from that, that's another concern too. When you're putting these rogue access points or evil access points and you have a shared facility, not only is that trying to get people within scope, but it's also increasing that. So you have to limit these things and tweak it. But if it's a property management, sometimes you can even get them to buy in for the whole facility and then
Yeah.
and gain some more clients that way too.
Yep.
So,
Good question.
any more questions?
Yep.
What's a good vehicle to use for surveillance?
Regular sedan, just a normal vehicle. You don't want anything like
Yeah.
bright colors or,
Yeah.
some fancy Camaro that you got from Enterprise.
The most boring, like mundane, everyday vehicle.
2 vehicles.
Yeah,
too.
get 2 of them as well if you're going to be doing surveillance for a longer, extended period of time. That way you can switch out. But yeah, the most boring thing you can get.
Yeah, and also if you're looking at really high traffic areas and stuff like that, so it's a little bit easier to blend in that way.
Yeah.
But you can even do some recon beforehand, look at the vehicles in the parking lot, some common vehicles.
Or a rickshaw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I
Yeah.
think we've reached our time, but we appreciate everybody. If you have any questions for Brent or I,
Thank you.
ask us. We have some stickers too. Yeah.
Thank you.